how do we create a go-to-market strategy for a hyperscale data center operator? How do we create go-to-market strategy for a data center operator focused on hyperscale? That's a fantastic question, and it's one that's very near and dear to me because we've just simply been having so many conversations lately with companies that are either looking to get new hyperscale projects off the ground or grow or expand. Just in the last 4, 5, 6 weeks, recorded a podcast interview with a marketing executive with a well-known global hyperscale company, recorded another podcast that's actually going to be coming live pretty soon, I think in the next week or two, with operations executive from one of the big 3 hyperscalers. And the big 3 are typically considered Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, and Amazon Web Services, AWS. Also had 2 people reach out last week with some brand new projects, I think one in APAC and one in Latin America, specifically to hyperscale, and had a consultation back in June with a mid-level sales director at one of the big 3 cloud companies, talking about content and thought leadership, sales enablement, and channel partner enablement, and what their organization should be focused on going forward to remain competitive. So hyperscale is and what's really interesting though is, even though having a lot of these conversations with hyperscale, I've also spoke to a couple of people that are not just working on edge. Edge by definition is kind of like the opposite of hyperscale, right? Is really, really small. And is close to the end user point for eliminating latency as possible. But there's also another camp, there's also another school of thought now that hyperscale has gotten too big. And with too big, it's too much of a central single point of failure, but it also has some downsides when it comes to sustainability. Because when you look at one of the bigger use cases around hyperscale and sustainability has to do with heat reuse. And in order for heat reuse to be effective, the data center needs to be located where there are end users, where there's residential, where there's commercial facilities that can benefit from having that heat reuse. So if a hyperscale data center is located in the middle of nowhere and there's no neighbors adjacent to that who can benefit from heat reuse, well, one of the big heat reuse cases goes out the window. That's also been a really interesting topic that's come up multiple times in the podcast in recent weeks, and you'll be seeing in some upcoming episodes. And again, what I'm talking about here is the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast, and you can make sure that you learn about upcoming episodes by subscribing to our newsletter or follow or subscribe anywhere else you normally would consume podcast episodes, like on our LinkedIn company page, our YouTube channel, and of course all the popular podcast aggregators like Apple, Spotify, Amazon. So anyway, how do we create a go-to-market strategy for a hyperscale data center operator? To put this in context, the first thing is there is significant life way beyond the big 3 hyperscalers when it comes to hyperscale data centers. In other words, there are significant multi-billion dollar and 8-figure, 9-figure businesses and beyond in and around hyperscale, beyond just Microsoft, Amazon, and Google. Of course, those big 3 tend to build their own facilities, but they also take space in other hyperscale and other co-location, and in some cases in wholesale facilities, to get closer to users, depending on the particular business need in that region or for specialized use cases. But at the end of the day, before you can figure out what the go-to-market strategy looks like, you need to be really dialed into where your company does best with your hyperscale solutions. And for huge companies, the first place we'd look for these clues is on your case studies or your solutions page. And we look for what kinds of industries, what kinds of locations, what size companies that you've historically done best at. Like we're building any kind of go-to-market strategy playbook. We first want to look at where we can win most often, where our clients are most successful, where they have the amazing experience with your customer success, with your account management teams, and they expand their usage over time. You're able to cross-sell complementary related services. They're a very strong source of positive digital word of mouth that helps to get your growth flywheel spinning even faster. So Once we know what your best clients, what your best hyperscale clients have in common, then we can go about defining your ideal client profile. So we know the region that you want to target, or regions that you want, geographic regions that you want to target potentially, the company sizes that make the most sense. Are you good with mid-market clients? Are you really good with selling hyperscale to these needle in a haystack SMBs, small and medium-sized businesses that have a need for hyperscale? Or are you going to primarily just focus on Fortune 1000 kind of clients that are looking for hyperscale? And then there's industry-specific, business model-specific qualifications that may come up when you are looking at what goes in your ICP, your ideal client profile. And this is especially relevant in areas where you're facing regulation. In other words, there's data center specific regulations that are unique to the European Union. There's ones that are unique to the United States. There's ones that are unique to special regions within each of those. And there's certainly regulations that come up that have to do with certain industries, such as in financial services, healthcare, government, e-commerce. There's a bunch of different areas, that a bunch of different capabilities that come up depending on the geographic region that you're targeting and the nature of your client's business. So once you have that documented, you'll have an idea of what your ideal client profile looks like. And from there, you can go out building your target account list. And it could be, depending on how tightly clustered together, how tightly defined your ideal client profile is, you may need more than one target account list. You may need more than one team going after these monster size accounts, these 800-pound gorilla accounts. Again, it may be a little counterintuitive, but there can sometimes be smaller startup-y kind of companies that have a need for hyperscale. You don't necessarily need to be a 10,000 plus employee company to be a buyer of hyperscale, but it tends to correlate a little more than you would think. But again, all of this comes down to, where has your company won the best? Where have you done the best? Where have you had the best track record? Where are your clients happiest? Where are your clients most successful? Where have you hit and consistently maintained product market fit and go to market fits? You know exactly what your unit economics are. You know, when you pour more capital into your growth engine, you know it continues to be productive. So you have your ideal client profile. You build out your target account list, which could be anywhere from a few dozen, usually a few hundred, sometimes a few thousand accounts that you want to build relationships with, because they look like they could be your great future hyperscale clients. And then within those accounts, what are the kinds of people that you want to build relationships with? Are they CTOs? Are they small enough that you need to build a relationship with a CEO? I was actually listening to someone talking about Microsoft's Azure business and how so many of these deals are so huge now that it's not the CTO anymore. That's the decision maker. It's the CEO and finance, the CFOs and the boards, because these are such huge decisions that are being made. So you need to understand, at the size of account you're going after, what are the buyer personas that you need to be educating and building trust with, that you need to build relationships with. And the most important kind of buyer persona, just to make sure we're on the same page, a buyer persona is a semi-fictional representation of an actual client that you want to do business with based on actual research and some select educated speculation. And when you're building and documenting, when you're researching and documenting these buyer personas, be super careful to make sure that you don't over-index on internal feedback. All too often, when people are building out buyer personas, they take that input from internal stakeholders. Like if you have a longtime sales director or marketing executive, and they're certain that they have all the answers because they've been in the industry a long time, it can be really dangerous to base your buyer personas purely based on internal input. So what I would caution you is, as you're doing the research and looking at the commonalities and building and documenting these buyer personas, internal input, meaning with your internal stakeholders, should be maybe 20% of the input. The other 80% needs to come from actual conversations, video interviews, surveys, studying how they talk, how they describe themselves on search and social, the kind of content they share, their watering holes where they hang out online and offline. Most of that needs to come from external research. And when you have the consensus on that, sometimes people tend to lump these in together with job titles. The reality, though, is the buyer personas have more to do with behaviors than pure demographics. So when you start to see consistencies in the kind of goals that a buyer persona needs to achieve to do well in their job, to keep their job, to potentially earn a promotion, to potentially earn a bonus, the commonalities among their goals tell you that you're probably finding a group that can be aggregated together into a single buyer persona. And the flip side of that, among their biggest challenges, among their biggest stressors, what's driving them nuts, what's causing them to miss time away from their friends, family, and loved one, what's ruining their vacations. When you see commonalities among those things, again, this can cross job titles and would tell you that it may be a single persona rather than multiple buyer personas. But especially on enterprise accounts, you're almost certainly going to have a segmentation strategy based on who they are and where they are in the journey. So based the who they are, your most important buyer persona you'll call your primary buyer persona. Your second most important buyer persona you call your secondary buyer persona. If there's a third buyer persona that you're actively going to target for educating and building trust with, that would be a tertiary buyer persona. And each one of these personas is going to need its own content and event strategy if you really want to knock it out of the park, especially if there's a lot of economic value associated with each of these groups of potential buyers. So let's say, for example, as a hyperscaler, you determine that it's CEOs of like health sciences companies and biotechnology companies or something like that that you're targeting. So you go and you do your research, you figure out the common goals and challenges that the CEOs of health science and biotech companies would have in common. And then from those goals and challenges, that will inform what your content and event strategy needs to look like. And you also need to figure out a way to be with them throughout the full buyer's journey. We now live in a world where people have become incredibly allergic to spending time with sales professionals. It used to be 10 years ago that most prospects, especially in that kind of situation, would meet with someone from your sales team when they were about halfway through the buyer's journey. At the prevailing time, CEB, the corporate executive board that's now part of Gartner, did some research with Salesforce and SiriusDecisions, and they found at the time, about 10 years ago, 56% of a typical buyer's journey was over before vendor contact, before sales contact. Add 10 years of digital transformation to that, add 2 years of most of the world working from home in the early 2020s, and we're now in a place where 83% of a typical journey is over before sales contact. Nearly all of the journey is over before you get to meet a prospect. And wow, does that change the nature of what you need to be doing to be competitive with your go-to-market strategy? So in order to be relevant, your sales team, your marketing team, your account managers, your product managers, your channel managers can no longer show up as vendor people. They no longer can show up as a transaction-focused salesperson, a transaction-focused account manager. They now need to arrive in front of prospects and clients way earlier on in the buyer's journey and show up as a teacher, a trusted advisor, a consultant, a subject matter expert, and maybe even elevating all the way up to a thought leader. So this is a really important repositioning exercise that most of your client-facing team needs to go through to stay relevant to the way that people research and compare and make purchase decisions when it comes to anything and everything having to do with hyperscale. So this dictates the nature of what you do with your blogging strategy, your video strategy, your podcast strategy, your webinar strategy, how you nurture your leads, and even your offline events, how you're going to do educational offline events. All too often by default, when I bring up event marketing or field marketing in and around the data center industry, people default to thinking of these huge conferences and even the large regional roadshow conferences. The reality, though, is you are almost certainly sharing the spotlight with dozens of other companies that are competing for attention at that particular event. If you really want to drive deep education building and deep trust building in lieu of or in addition to those kinds of mega conferences, I'd encourage you to be hosting your own events. Obviously, logistically, cost-wise and everything, streaming events and webinars have a much lower entry point than doing your own physical events offline. But depending on the nature of how closely clustered together your client base may be, if your clients are located relatively close proximity to where you have facilities, and your facilities have a nice classroom or a big conference room or something, it's shockingly affordable for anyone and everyone that is watching this live stream to put together an amazing breakfast seminar series or lunch and learn series where you invite a few dozen prospects and clients together monthly, quarterly, what have you, and you supply your own internal speakers to talk about topics that you know are top of mind for that particular buyer persona. How do you know what's top of mind? What's going to get them excited enough about wanting to come have bagels, coffee, and learn with you and network with peers for an hour on a Wednesday morning? Well, because we're not going to guess. We're going to use the buyer persona research to dictate our content and our event strategy. So if you think you need a massive budget to pull off that kind of strategy, again, if you have your own facility and you have your own training room or classroom or conference room in your facilities and you're targeting in the local area, and all you're really talking about doing is bringing in some catering for breakfast or lunch or something, or a cocktail party in the evening or something, you'd be shocked at how effective these kinds of grassroots efforts can be when you're focusing on one particular buyer persona at one particular stage of the buyer's journey, and you have your goals in mind of what you're looking to achieve from that kind of event. So we could do a whole hour-long session. We could do a whole webinar on building go-to-market strategy for hyperscale data centers. But I hope I've given you a good preview into some of the big considerations that I'd be thinking about if you're tasked with thinking about putting together, optimizing, recalibrating, repositioning your hyperscale go-to-market strategy to be relevant to the way that modern buyers research, compare options, and evaluate pricing when it comes to making major considered hyperscale purchase decisions. It's a very different buyer than you would have had 10 years ago. Sure, if you're selling to the extreme 5 or 10% that's over 75 years old and isn't quite as addicted to these as millennials and Gen Z and even Gen X to a certain degree, yeah, you may want to do things a little bit more the way you used to do it 10 years ago. But for nearly everyone else, if you're selling to a buyer, a stakeholder, a committee that is doing tons of research on search and social and posing questions on Discords and Slacks and texting their friends and asking questions on LinkedIn and watching webinars and review sites and podcasts, which largely describes all of us. Again, your buyer personas will validate this. It's super important that you show up as a subject matter expert, a teacher, a trusted advisor, and a consultant. That's the only way that you're going to get invited in early and often to their side of the table as a trusted advisor.